Let's Talk It Out, An Argument for Civil Discourse by Teddy Hastreiter. This presentation poses the question, how do we respond to those with whom we deeply disagree? In a disagreement where we're each left to our own moral views, I argue that we should preserve mutual respect and individual personhood at all costs. Some examples of these moral issues are situations such as the death penalty, abortion, whether or not you're pro-life or pro-choice, divorce, and the ethical and moral implications that come with suicide. This brings us to Thomas E. Hill's work, Must Respect Be Earned? He says, we must acknowledge everyone's humanity, which we all share in common. He argues, humanity, or being human, is itself a moral position that calls for respectful recognition. That is, as moral agents, we are morally obligated to respect each other's humanity. In a moral disagreement with someone, I deserve respect merely because I can acknowledge that I am worthy of respect. The same is true for the other person, because we already owe it to each other as rational human beings. Appearing Respectful, The Moral Significance of Manners by Sarah Buss. Buss argues, persons are ends in themselves and must be acknowledged as such. Like Hill, she claims that human beings have a special dignity or intrinsic value that makes them worthy of respect. For Buss, we have a moral obligation to make ourselves agreeable to others. Good manners, then, directly acknowledges our intrinsic value as human beings. For Buss, a person's value depends on how they are treated. When we are in a disagreement, we have a moral obligation to exercise good manners and respect each other, because the alternative, which is disrespecting the other person's humanity and therefore lessening their value as a person, is much worse. Next, I'd like to discuss Moral Conflict and Political Consensus by Amy Gutman and Dennis Thompson. For them, we show respect for persons by joining with them in seriousness and sustained moral discussion on the issue in question and other issues that divide us. We do this by affirming the status of our own position and acknowledging the moral status of the other position. I affirm the status of my position by keeping my view consistent, not allowing it to shift with my own self-interest, and accepting the implications that come with having that view. I acknowledge the moral status of the other position by 1, treating their point of view as a moral view rather than just a practical one, 2, staying open to possibly revising my view in the future, or 3, rejecting them in a way that still takes their view seriously. Gutman and Thompson argue we should value reaching conclusions through reason rather than force, and more specifically, through moral reasoning rather than through self-interested bargaining. That brings us to Gutman and Thompson's principles of accommodation. These are principles that govern the ways in which we treat each other in a moral disagreement. They include affirming the status of my own position and the moral status of the other position. However, they also serve as restraints that govern our relations with those that which we disagree. For Gutman and Thompson, such principles are essential for dealing with the problem of moral disagreement, and they should go beyond the idea of toleration. They should be understood as resting on the idea of mutual respect, which is a prerequisite of democratic liberty. This brings us to, again, mutual respect. For Gutman and Thompson, mutual respect manifests a distinctively democratic kind of character, the character of individuals who are morally committed, self-reflective about their communities, discerning of the difference between respectable and merely tolerable differences of opinion, and open to the possibility of changing their minds or modifying their positions at some time in the future, if they confront unanswerable objections to their present point of view. As I said earlier, mutual respect is at the heart of moral deliberation. For Gutman and Thompson, moral deliberation constitutes part of the conditions necessary to sustain moral discussion among free and equal citizens. Through reason rather than coercion, moral deliberation can preserve each other's personhood. By having little regard for the self, we are able to remain open-minded to challenge by generally accepted methods of inquiry. For Gutman and Thompson, moral deliberation is virtuous. It aims at the good of both parties. Even if they do not resolve any particular moral conflict, they remain valid as the only basis on which we can hope to arrive at reasonable resolutions of substantive moral conflict in the future. To better express this idea of moral deliberation, I wanted to give an example of a moral disagreement. For this example, person A and person B are engaged in a moral disagreement over whether doctor-assisted suicide is a morally permissible choice for a family member diagnosed with an illness that is painful, debilitating, and without a known cure. According to Gutman and Thompson, for a position to count as moral, it must, first, presuppose a disinterested perspective that could be adopted by any member of society, whatever his or her other particular circumstances, such as class, race, or sex. This disinterested position should not be self-regarding, as we said before. Rather, it should focus on keeping the discussion open for debate, for challenges, etc. In a scenario where person A believes doctor-assisted suicide is wrong because no one should be able to play God, person B may believe in doctor-assisted suicide if the amount of pain experienced by their family member makes their life unlivable. In a disagreement like this, where both sides make claims that are susceptible to accepted methods of inquiry, both sides should reach a level of neutrality to not only treat each other's views seriously, but to respect and preserve one another's personhood. While exploring these ideas of mutual respect in civil discourse, I noticed some possible problems that could come up when we're partaking in moral deliberation. 1. Humans are rational, but we're also emotional and appetitive, at least if you're looking at it from Plato's model of the soul. Because of that, human beings can struggle with making the ends of another person's their own when it comes to heated topics such as abortion or suicide. One might then argue that human egos are too big to properly give mutual respect and partake in moral deliberation when it comes to reaching a level of neutrality and taking other views seriously. Because of that, we should lean into the principles of accommodation, those restraints that really allow us to partake in moral deliberation with each other. I'd like to end with some final thoughts. In order to give civil discourse or moral deliberation a real chance, we must acknowledge that we live in a pluralistic society where citizens disagree on moral issues like whether doctor-assisted suicide is morally right or wrong. Because of this, Gutman and Thompson argue we should try to break personal and institutional habits that discourage our accepting the position of our opponents at some time in the future, or at least of modifying our own position in the direction of that of our opponents. As rational human beings, we should work to reach conclusions through reason rather than coercion. If an agreement can't be reached in the moment, of course we should agree to disagree, but we should remain open-minded to new information that could possibly change our view in the future. In doing this, we're not only respecting our fellow human being, but we're taking their view seriously at the same time. This is crucial when partaking in moral deliberation and civil discourse, and preserving mutual respect all around.